Bruchot habaot, ladies, and welcome to another edition of Torah Anytime. Today, the weather out there is, Baruch Hashem, very challenging. Many of us are at home and hopefully tuning in to Torah Anytime so that we could reap the rewards of this weather and learn as much Torah as possible since we're all at home. Therefore, I felt it was incumbent upon myself to study with you today, one-on-one, the lessons of this week's Parshat, and to bring into your home the warmth, the esh, the fires of Torah, the fire of inspiration, so that you can go into this cold weather, into Shabbat, with tremendous hitchaskut. And Be'ezrat Hashem, in the middle of our shiur, I'm going to give more information. Some of you were writing in about how you could donate to our cause, to the renovations that we are trying to begin so that we can have a more expanded space for more ladies to join us here in our area. So in the middle of the shiur, I am going to speak about it and also present you with a demonstration of what Ohel Sarah is really all about. You'll get to see firsthand. But let's begin with this week's parasha. We're going to discuss the essence of the first Jewish exile, Galut Mitzrayim. In discussing the story of Egypt, we're somewhat at a disadvantage because it's difficult for us to relate today to the idea of being in exile. Baruch Hashem, we're living in the United States of America, in a democratic society, and while living here is invigorating, we're still in the galut on some level. But it's nevertheless what we call a sweet galut. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very kind to us. We don't understand what it means to have our children, chaz v'shalom, be thrown into a river, or what it means to be a slave for 210 years. Therefore, it's difficult for us to comprehend the backdrop of the slavery in Egypt since it's so removed from us, Baruch Hashem. But not too long ago, ladies, just a little over 70 years ago, the Jewish people underwent a very dark exile. Referring to the Holocaust that took place in Nazi Germany and throughout Europe during the 1940s. Although the war only lasted about 5 to 6 years, it certainly did the damage of 210 years and even more. So since the Holocaust is closer to our time, we can more easily relate to that time period. And if we understood how the Holocaust worked, we can understand what took place in Egypt all those years ago. So today we're going to explore the correlation between the two periods in Jewish history, and we're going to discover many fascinating lessons because many of the things that Hitler, Yemach Shemo v'Zichro, did were actually a reflection of his predecessor Paro, who patented many mechanisms in order to torture the Jews, both physically and mentally. Now, the first thing we need to know is that the Galut in Mitzrayim did not begin overnight. It progressed slowly. The Jews came down to Egypt under very good conditions. Yaakov Avinu Olav Shalom was greeted with tremendous honor, with tremendous kavod. Paro gave him his own city to live in. Also, the Jews had their own ghetto. Yaakov Avinu was able to build a yeshiva, and Jews were able to study Torah. The Jewish people, at least until all the 12 tribes perished, lived a fairly decent life in Egypt. They were free from troubles. There was no friction between Am Yisrael and the Egyptian government. The tension began after the last tribe, Shevet Levi, died. At this point, the Jews began to multiply in abundance. The Pasuk says, Uvnei Yisrael par'u v'yishretzu v'yirbu. There was a population explosion. Not only that, but the Pasuk says, V'timaleh ha'aretz otam, and the land was filled with Jews. The Midrash tells us that wherever you went, there were Jews all over the place. This became a different type of lifestyle that they were used to living, because until now, all the Jews were living in Goshen. They were isolated by choice. They wanted to remain separate, and they didn't want to assimilate and to become involved with the Egyptian culture, which we know was steeped in immorality. But once the last of the Shvatim died, once Levi died, the next generation became more modernized, for lack of a better word. Vatimaleha aratzotam. Now Egypt was suddenly filled with Jews. And this was a new phenomenon for Egyptians as well, because they rarely saw Jews in the past. The Jews rarely came out of the confines of their city. But the Midrash says that the Egyptian theaters became filled with Jews. Chachamim explained that the Egyptians, they'd walk into the theaters and they would find the seats occupied by the Jewish people, which was a rarity. But anyway, not only that, the Jews began to mingle with the Egyptians, and eventually they even adapted their culture and their customs. Once that happened, the Egyptians' attitude towards the Jews began to change significantly. You see, ladies, as long as we remained separate, there were no problems. But once we came out and we began to be like the Egyptians, that's when the Egyptians began to feel threatened. And you should know that this is a general rule in the world of anti-Semitism. Many of us assume that if we mingle with the Gentiles and become friendly with them and dress like them and speak like them and behave like them, then they'll accept us and they'll love us. But history has proven that this is unequivocally incorrect. Time after time, whenever we went out and began to modernize ourselves, when we assimilated in an attempt to become more like the Ummot HaOlam, the more we got pushed aside, the more Kadosh Baruch Hu taught us a lesson. And guess what? Chachamim tell us that that's actually a blessing. Hashem wants to keep us separate. So do you know what He does? He instills anti-Semitism in the Goy in order to place us in our proper place so that we shouldn't lose our identity. And that's the same idea that took place during the times of Ahasuerus, for example. Haman, the anti-Semite, wanted to annihilate all the Jewish people, men, women, and children. He was the Hitler of his day. And Haman didn't need too much of a reason to hate the Jews. It was in his blood. But Chachamim ask, what caused Haman to become frustrated and agitated to the extent that it led to his motivation of destroying the entire Jewish population? The answer is, when the Jews attended Ahasuerus' party, it angered Haman. What happened there? Ahasuerus made a big party, and he invited all the citizens of the surrounding area. Now, there wasn't any kosher food at the party, you should know. And suddenly, Haman walks in and sees that a multitude of Jews are sitting there with them. So he thought to himself, what is this? Jews are sitting with us at this party? I see we can't even go to a party anymore without a Jew being present there. They're all over the place. Haman became so agitated, and he began to formulate a plan to destroy the Jewish people. Baruch Hashem, that Borei Olam destroyed his plans, but the lesson is that the Goyim resented when Jews come into their areas and monopolize their territories. Take, for example, the Anti-Defamation League. Until today, they make a lot of noise whenever there's a country club or some resort somewhere in the world that doesn't allow Jews to participate. They make a big stink. But if you think about it for a minute, what type of Jews do these clubs and resorts refuse to admit? What type of Jews? Jews that are like them, that are living like them. Jews that don't eat kosher foods, that don't have some semblance of Yadut in their life, that aren't so devout. Those are the ones they're excommunicating from the resort clubs. You think that these types of clubs are targeting Hasidic Jews? Absolutely not. Because hopefully a Hasidic Jew won't be seen in such a place. And we hope And if he does show up, he'll probably bring along his little lunch bag, carrying his own food. As he's not going to use their silverware. He's not going to touch the buffet. That kind of Jew doesn't threaten the Gentile. They're not afraid that he's going to take over their club because he doesn't mingle with them. He keeps himself separate. It's the ones that are behaving like the Goyim that the Goyim have a problem with. Because they're thinking to themselves, what do we need these Jews here for? All they want to do is imitate us and steal our ways and our money eventually. But the Anti-Defamation League, what do they do? They step in and they try to assume equal rights for these poor, irreligious Jews who want to assimilate into these clubs. Could you believe that? Instead of fighting assimilation, instead of fighting for Jewish education and seeing to it that more Jews know about Judaism so that they should maintain a proper identity, these people over here are busy fighting and establishing equal rights for the Jewish people. Believe me, that the Goyim wouldn't be so threatened by us if we would keep our distance and remain separate from them. But going back to Mitzrayim, as long as the Shvatim were alive, the Jews behaved themselves appropriately. There's a story told about the Chafetz Chaim alav shalom who was planning on moving to Eretz Yisrael. And Rav Chaim Ozer Grzinski alav shalom sent him a message saying the following: Kvod Harav, you cannot move to Eretz Yisrael. You're a role model to everyone here in Poland. And I'm nervous that if you leave, the entire Jewish community is going to sink another few levels. And he meant to say that as long as the Chafetz Chaim didn't move away, then no Jew is going to get out of line. But if he would leave, it could very well be that problems will arise. And the same thing happened in Egypt. Once the Shevatim died, there were no real role models left, and that inevitably caused the Jews to regress. And the same thing happened in Nazi Germany. Although there were many Chachamim in other areas of Europe, in Germany itself, many rabbis had already emigrated to other countries. Therefore, many of the German Jews began to assimilate and to adapt the German culture. It's interesting to note, by the way, that years before the Holocaust began, the Saba of Kelm, alav shalom, who was a big tzaddik, announced something that today we know was prophetic. He made this statement in the 1800s when during that time there lived a man by the name of Abraham Geiger, Yimach Shemo, who was one of the founders of the Reformed movement. This guy authored a new code of law for the Jewish people. In his new book, it stated that we could now marry goyim, that kosher food was no longer a necessity. Bekitzur, he made a new Shulchan Aruch. So the Saba of Kelm said that as a result of the sin of this new Shulchan Aruch that was comprised by Geiger, there's going to come a time where the goyim are also going to comprise their own Shulchan Aruch. And in their Shulchan Aruch it's going to say, Tov she'bayehudim harog. The best of the Jews should be killed. Do you hear these words? The Saba of Kelm witnessed the commencement of the Reformed movement in Europe, and he felt that it was the beginning of the end. You see, these chutzpanim, the founders of the Reformed movement, thought that assimilation would be the answer to anti-Semitism. But the Saba of Kelm said, absolutely not. You think that your assimilation will cause the Gentiles to admire and love us? On the contrary, they'll push us back quite far. Listen to those words, because it was that way. The Nazis attempted to trace the lineage of a German Jew as back as 6 generations in order to determine that Jew's pure Jewish roots. You hear that? So we already see a correlation between the way in which Galut Mitzrayim began and the way in which the Galut in Germany began. It began when the Jews crossed the border, when they went beyond where they were meant to remain, and they allowed the outside influences to penetrate their homes. The question is, how is it possible that an entire nation, be it Egyptians or Germans, how can an entire nation accept the fact of genocide? In every society, they're decent people, they're good people. Most people in society aren't criminals. They're not villains or murderers. So how is it possible for society to have allowed Paro or Hitler to do what they did? Why was there no public opinion against it? Why did nobody fight against what took place? Not in Egypt, not in Germany. Why not? Well, in the case of Egypt, which we consider to be, by the way, the Ima Galut, like the model Galut, Paro used a scheme of propaganda. The hatred towards the Jews didn't happen overnight. Paro began to change the perception of the Jews in the eyes of the Egyptians. Now, we know they didn't have newspapers back then in Egypt or any other forms of modern communication. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have internet. But Paro, in his sinister way, was able to mold public opinion that the Jew is no good. He's a trickster. He's not trustworthy. You have to be careful from the Jewish people. Now, how do we know that this is what Paro did? Where in the Torah is this mentioned? In our Parshat Shemot. Paro meets with his advisors and he says to them, Hava nitchak malo. Let us make a plan against the Jewish people. Let's be wiser than them. Why does he say that? Pen yirbe. Because Paro was worried that the Jews were multiplying in abundance. Vehaya ki tikrana milchama. And in the event that we're going to be at war with some foreign army, v'nilcham banu ve'ala min haaretz. Paro was concerned that the Jews are going to join his enemies and together they would uproot the Egyptians from their land. That was the rumor, the propaganda that began to circulate among the Egyptians. The Jews are a threat. The Jews are a danger. They're going to stab the Egyptians in the back. They're not trustworthy people. Of course, this entire line of reasoning was ridiculous and fabricated and unfounded because in reality, the Jews were very loyal citizens. They were living in Goshen, minding their own business, not hurting anybody. As a matter of fact, look at Yosef HaTzadik. He saved Egypt from an economic breakdown during the famine. He helped build new cities. There would have been no prosperity in Egypt if it hadn't been for the Jewish people. Not only that, but when Yaakov Avinu came down to Egypt with his entire family, the Nile River overflowed and there was tremendous beracha as long as he lived there. So if anything, the Jews were the most loyal citizens of Egypt. They paid their taxes, they didn't commit any crimes. But Paro was determined to change the world's opinion regarding the Jewish people. So he began to invent rumors about them. And of course, as time went on, the attitude of the Egyptians began to change and even became justified in their eyes. And Hitler, Yamach Shemo, did the same thing. He hired the best media advisors who waged such false propaganda against the Jews in Germany, miskenim. They would show pictures of the Jews with their facial features all misconstrued so that they would appear different and ugly. They were pictures that displayed Jews sucking the blood of the Germans. They showed in the movie theaters, in the German theaters, mice and rats coming out of the sewers, and then they would depict the rats as Jews. And eventually, over time, anti-Semitism began to rise in Europe. The Germans began to see us as dangerous, money-hungry, blood-sucking vermins who wanted to take over the world and contaminate it. And all of a sudden, after some time, the Germans bought into this propaganda because it's very easy to sell anti-Semitism to a goy. And Hitler, through his charisma and oratory skills, you mamish see, when you see clips of this man speaking, you mamish see the Satan in him. It's crazy to see. the power of speech. In his eyes was the Satan. But anyway, he motivated and excited an entire country against the Jewish people. So who did he learn that from? From Paro. It's the exact same scandal. As a matter of fact, in Parashat Kitavo, there's a pasuk that describes how Paro dealt with us. And we read this pasuk in the Haggadah of Pesach every single year. The pasuk says, Vayareu otanu hamitzrim. The Egyptians were cruel to Bnei Israel. That's a simple explanation. But there's another explanation that discusses the grammar of this pasuk. Because if the pasuk is meant to imply that the Egyptians were cruel to us, it should have read, Vayareu lanu. Lanu would mean to us. They were cruel to us. But to use the words Vayareu otanu literally means they made us bad. What does it mean that they made us bad? It means that they made us look bad in the eyes of the Egyptian citizens. Because of Paro's propaganda and all the lies, the Egyptians saw the Jews in a very bad light. Paro and his advisors made us look like a wicked nation. Therefore, Paro, like Hitler, was able to fulfill his mission. Now, it's important to make this correlation because we all know that Hitler was evil. But Paro, for some reason, isn't looked at as the Hitler that he was. Paro is always categorized as this biblical figure who got beaten up by the plagues, by the makot. To many of us, he's like this misken because of all the punishments that he received. Poor guy. But you have to know that for 210 years, before that 1 year of plagues, the image that you should have in your mind of Paro is the following. First of all, the Gemara describes him as a very short man. Hitler was also very short. Paro was evil and ruthless, like Hitler. That's the image that has to be conjured up in your mind when you think about Paro. He was a Nazi on the highest level. Now, according to the Gemara, the slavery began as avodat parech, very difficult labor. But the word parech has two meanings. Parech could mean back-breaking labor, or it could be an abbreviation of two words, perach, which means a soft mouth. What does that mean? Paro managed to get the Jews to work for him by announcing that for the sake of national unity and building the country, everyone has to work for the government. Originally, everyone in Egypt went to work, not just the Jews. So the Jewish people didn't realize that they were being cajoled, fooled into becoming slaves. They thought they're being decent countrymen like everybody else going out to work. So they went out to work willingly. And it was only after Paro, with his soft mouth, convinced them to work for him, that he stopped all the Egyptians from continuing to work, and the Jews were pretty much the only ones left with the back-breaking labor. And then from one day to the next, Paro decided to stop paying the Jews for their hard work, and he demanded that they continue to work just as hard without a salary. And from day to day, it became increasingly worse. And that's no different from the Nazis. Before they take the Jews to the gas chambers, they would tell all the Jews that they're going to work. They put signs up on all the gates that read, Arbeit macht frei, work makes freedom. They made us think that because of the war, the country needs to be rebuilt. So the Jewish people, as they were being led away to those stuffy cattle cars, thought they're going to labor camps to work for the country. Little did they know that once they arrived to those camps, no one else was going to be there with them. They were the only ones who were going to work, and they were probably going to be the only ones who would die. And eventually, they were gassed to death. It's the same perach, the same method. You see the correlation? When we put Egypt in perspective to Germany, our heart has to skip a beat, and we have to be taken aback. But you should know that in Egypt it was quite the same. The Ramban, alav shalom, in one of his Sfarim of Halachot, writes that Avodat Parech is the following. I'm going to quote you his Lashon. Ezohi Avodat Parech. How do we define Avodat Parech, difficult labor? Zu avodah she'en la kitzba. It's the kind of work where you don't give the employee a finishing time, so the work seems like it's never ending. And that kind of work could drive a person crazy. This is a type of psychological torture. But when a person knows that work ends at 4 p.m., in his mind he knows that his work is eventually coming to an end and he's going to go home very soon. But when you don't inform a worker as to when his day is going to end, it's psychologically tormenting. Not only that, but the Ramban adds, Avodah she'eino tzarich la. It was the kind of work where you tell the worker to do something, but you don't really need that work to be done. You don't really need that work to be done. It's obvious that it's just to keep him busy and working, and that's that, and even to torture him. For example, let's say that you're the employer. You tell the worker, go boil me some water. Your worker goes, boils up the water and asks you, should I make you a tea? And you say, no. Go dig me a hole in the ground. In other words, you tell him to do things with no real purpose, and that could also drive a person crazy. Furthermore, after he's already done something, you undo it. We built huge buildings for Paro, and we were told to build them in a particular spot. After we'd finished the work, the next day, we'd come back and realize that the buildings were built on quicksand. The buildings would sink to the ground. You know what kind of feeling it was for the Jewish people? They felt no sense of accomplishment because they worked so hard to complete the work, only to find that the following day the building vanished. And once the building sank into the sand, Paro would decree that the Jews build that building all over again for free in the same spot. That's the Avodat Parech we're talking about. This is the difficult labor that the Egyptians burdened the Jews with. It's not just physical labor, it's mental torture. And that was no different from the concentration camps in Germany. The work had no logic over there. We weren't building anything productive. It was just plain slave labor. We didn't know the goal for our work or when the day is going to end. It was psychological torture. Ladies, I'm trying to teach you how striking the correlations are between the Egyptian exile and the Holocaust in Germany. We're moving on. Paro set up a system of shotrim, officers. Who were the shotrim? The shotrim were the Jewish managers that were in charge of the Jewish slaves. Their job was to ensure that the Jews were doing their jobs properly, and these shotrim then had to report back to their Egyptian overseers who were their superiors. Many of these shotrim were tzaddikim, and they realized that they were in a very difficult position. They knew that if they don't get productivity from their fellow brothers, the Egyptians are going to beat the Jewish slaves. And in Parashat Shemot, our parasha, the Torah HaKdosha informs us that the shotrim took the beatings from the Egyptian superiors in order to protect their fellow brothers. You hear this? That's not so different from the Germanic era. Hitler did the same thing. He put officers over the Jewish people in the concentration camps and ghettos. And these officers were Jewish themselves. They were called Judenreich. These poor officers would have to report back to the Nazis and oversee the Jewish people. They were also in a very difficult position. They knew that when the Nazis are going to come and analyze the productivity report, that the Jews might die as a result of the unproductive labor. And often, very often, they try to cover for their fellow brothers and sisters. And unfortunately, we can't judge, but there were many Jewish officers that abused their rank and they tortured their fellow brothers and sisters. It was a horrible, horrible time. But the point is that Germany used the same system that was established in Egypt 3,500 years earlier. So my question is, why didn't the Jews in Mitzrayim rebel? There were millions of Jews in Egypt, and still there was no united effort to rebel against Paro. That's inconceivable if you think about it. They should have band together and stormed the palace gates. But we don't see any kind of an uprising or rebellion by the Jews against the Egyptian Empire. And it was almost the same in Germany, with the exception of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which wasn't successful ultimately. But throughout the years during the German era, we don't see any resistance on the part of the Jewish people. It's as if the Jews were resigned to their fate and they walked with their heads down, accepting the cruel treatment, and they walked to their deaths. Why? Ibn Ezra alav shalom explains this idea by using Egypt as an example. He says that when the Jews were leaving Egypt after the Makot, they arrived at the sea, at the Yam Suf. At the Yam Suf, before the sea split, they noticed that the Egyptians were chasing them from behind, and they went into a panic. They realized that they were sandwiched in between the sea and the Egyptian army. So the people began to complain to Moshe Rabbeinu that they wanted to go back to Egypt. All the Chachamim ask, HaKadosh Baruch Hu just took Am Yisrael out of Egypt with tremendous miracles, with wonders. So why is it that now the Jews were being so passive? Why were they allowing themselves to submit to the Egyptians? Ibn Ezra says that it was because the Jews didn't know anything else but how to be slaves. It's a mentality that was drilled into their heads for 210 years. They believed that the Egyptians were their masters and that the masters are the ones who control their lives. So when the Egyptians chased Am Yisrael, the Jewish people were afraid because they were still in their slave-like mentality. And that's the same thing that took place in Germany. Many Jewish people became afflicted with this type of mentality. They thought that the Germans were too powerful and overwhelming. They decided that any resistance would be fatal. They accepted their fate as the victims, and that's why they didn't rebel. Moving on. One aspect of Galut Mitzrayim that's overlooked is when the Jews finally left Egypt. Now, I know you all think that the Jews left Egypt with a lot of money. We even know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Bnei Israel that they should take back their money and all that jewelry that the Egyptians stole from them. But the pasuk on this inyan says the following. Listen to the wording. Daber na. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu to plead with the Jewish people and beg them to take the money back from their oppressors. And Chachamim ask, do you have to beg people to take money? You might have to beg them to pray in the morning. You might have to beg them to keep a kosher home. You might have to beg a Jewish person to keep the Shabbat. You might have to beg a Jewish woman, for example, to be more tznu'ah. But to beg them to take money, it's in their interest to take the money. So why does the pasuk say, Daber na, please, Hashem is begging, please impress upon the people to take their money back from the Egyptians? There's a very interesting explanation that's brought down from a big Talmid Chacham called the Oznaim LaTorah. He writes that if you put it in perspective to the compensations of war that the Jews are still receiving today, Germany was forced to pay enormous amounts of funds, whether to Israel or to the victims and their families. Until today, Germany continues to pay what we call war reparations. But during the time that Germany was making all those payouts, there were many survivors that were against it and they didn't want to take the money. They thought to themselves, what? We should let them pay us for what they did to us? As if to say what? That by paying us, they're now exonerated from all their crimes? This is blood money. How can we take money when 6 million Jews perished in the most horrific way? What, the Germans are trying to pay us off? Does this money b'chlal mean anything to us? Can all the money in the world change what was done? Can all the money in the world bring back our loved ones? And there was a big movement of survivors who didn't want to accept this money. The Jews after the Holocaust needed to be forced to accept the money. They had to be persuaded to take the money. And it's the same thing with Egypt, says the Oznaim LaTorah. You could imagine how the Jews of Mitzrayim felt. After all, they worked for 210 years, and suddenly on their way out, they're told to take the money from the Egyptians. There could have been a big movement against the acceptance of this money. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, using the lashon of daberna. Hashem said, please beg them to take the money. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to have this money because it belonged to us. It was rightfully ours. We see in this example how even the compensation that we received from the Egyptians was similar to the compensation that the Jewish people received after World War II. Ladies, the correlations are fascinating. But moving on, Yetziat Mitzrayim led to one of the most important gifts that the Jewish people received, and that's of course the revelation at Har Sinai, when Am Yisrael received the Torah HaKadosha from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And following Matan Torah, we became deserving of the land of Israel. Although it was a very long 40-year trip in the desert, which was really supposed to last just a few days of travel, but due to our sins, HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned our few days into a journey of 40 years. But the point is that in order to obtain Eretz Yisrael, we needed to experience this horrible exile of Mitzrayim. The exile needed to precede Eretz Yisrael. And it's interesting to note that right after World War II, in 1946, when it ended, just 2 years later, in 1948, the Jewish people were given back the land of Israel that hadn't been in our possession for over 2,000 years. Now, ladies, I'm about to get into an extremely sensitive topic, so bear with me. I have to add that there are various opinions as to whether or not that was a good thing that happened to the Jewish people. There are machlokot between the Rabbanim. Many Gdolei Israel felt that since HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't give us the official permission to enter the land and settle there, just like He used to do in the olden days, in ancient times, that meant that we shouldn't be settling there under a pseudo-Jewish government. As a matter of fact, if you read Jewish history, the original Israeli government was more Zionistic than they were Jewish. Their entire mahalach, their entire approach was extremely secular. And we all know, if you read the history books, we all know that Herzl's intent in trying to establish a Jewish state was in order to actually convert the Jews to Christianity. And certainly many Rabbanim felt that if we were already going to establish a quote-unquote Jewish state, and especially if it's without the official permission, allowance of the Ribono Shel Olam, it should at least be governed by the laws of Torah. Otherwise, it defeats the entire purpose of the matana, of the gift. When these Zionists abolished many of the Jewish codes, and they didn't see to it that the Jewish state lives by a religious moral code of Torah, many Rabbanim felt that inevitably this is going to be detrimental to the Jewish people, and that many Jewish souls would get swallowed up by the Zionistic movement, and eventually they would abandon their faith. And that's what happened. I do believe, ladies, that as privileged as we are to have Eretz Yisrael, and it belongs to us by right, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu's promise to Avraham Avinu and all the Avot HaKadoshim, the land belongs to us. However, I do agree with these Rabbanim who feel that If a Jewish state is in existence, it's a little bit shameful when it isn't governed according to the laws of Moshe and the Torah that was given to our people. In this lies the conflict that many Gedolim have with the idea of quote-unquote Zionism. I'm just giving you a little bit of a history lesson so you understand the conflict. Like, why do people stand there protesting? Not saying that they should, because that is a Chilul Hashem. They should not do that. But anyway, going back to our lesson today, we see the connection between the Galut of Egypt and Eretz Yisrael. The good news is that as a result of gaining back Eretz Yisrael, many yeshivot were built. Torah began to flourish again on some level. And if you visit Eretz Yisrael today, there are thousands of young men and women who are studying Torah. But I have to say that it's just very sad that those who stand at the helm of the Jewish state aren't necessarily the prime examples of what it means to live a Jewish life. I have tremendous admiration for someone like Bibi Netanyahu, who I think is truly one of the best prime ministers Israel has ever had, dafka because he's not the type of person who easily submits to the demands of the world. He doesn't buckle easily. So I have tremendous admiration for him. But I do think that if you are representing the Jewish people, and you call Israel the Jewish state, and you're supposed to reflect the Jewish nation, why don't you wear kippah on your head? Why don't you put on a pair of tzitzit? How come when you greet world leaders in the Jewish state, in Eretz Yisrael, why is your head uncovered? Why when you come to America in hopes of representing the Jewish people, there's no kippah on your head? It's just very sad to see and to know that Eretz Yisrael is not governed by Torah law. And I'm trying to explain to you, that's where a lot of the conflict arises. But anyway, moving on. I want to end the shiur with a very powerful sod that truly demonstrates not only the correlation between the two eras in Jewish history that we've been discussing until now, but also teaches us that history does repeat itself, and it does so when we don't learn the lessons of the past or heed the advice of the Ribono Shel Olam. In Parashat Bo, the 9th Makkah is Choshech, darkness. That's the 9th plague. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings a darkness upon Egypt that was unlike any darkness we know. The Mefarshim describe it as a darkness so thick you couldn't move your limbs. It was a darkness beyond the darkness of this world. Now, one of the things that took place during this Makkah was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructed the Jews to go to the homes of the Egyptians in order to retrieve all the belongings that the Egyptians stole from them all those years ago. And since for the Jewish people they had light and not dark, they were able to regain their possessions. Okay. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu also utilized this plague in order to wipe out the Reshaim among Bnei Israel. All those Jewish people who doubted, all those who assimilated in Egypt, all those who didn't follow the path instructed to them by our Avot HaKadoshim and Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom, all those who didn't believe in the redemption, or worse, they didn't want to leave Egypt, HaKadosh Baruch Hu used the plague of darkness in order to strike them down. Why during the plague of darkness especially? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't want the Egyptians to assume that the Jews were being punished in the same way they are. He didn't want them to see it. But not only that, but since so many Jewish people perished during this plague, the 3 days of darkness gave the surviving family members enough time to bury their dead without the Egyptians suspecting anything. That's a simple explanation. But ladies, let's take a closer look at this plague of darkness and see how it applies to a future time as well. Let's look closely into the psukim and recognize something dramatically powerful. The pasuk in Parashat Bo says the following: Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hakadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Netei yadcha al hashamayim. Stretch forth your hand towards the heavens. V'yi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, and there shall be darkness upon the land of Egypt. Vayamesh choshech, and the darkness will become darker. I want to look at the words Vayamesh choshech, and the darkness will become darker. What does that mean? What is it implying beyond the simplistic interpretation that the darkness was so thick that it was tangible? Rashi HaKadosh Alav Hashalom explains that the darkness was so thick that it was beyond the darkness of night. And then later on, he quotes the Midrash Agadah that describes the darkness in the following way: Shehaya kafol umechupal ve'av ad shehaya bo mamash, which means the darkness was doubled and redoubled and thick to the degree that it was tangible. You could actually feel it. You were mamish able to feel the darkness. But the question is, why the double lashon? Shehaya kaful umechupal. Okay, we know it was double as thick. That's shehaya kaful. It was double as thick, that darkness. Why add the words umechupal? Double and redoubled. Why that extra double? Some of the Chachamim explain that these two expressions apply to different tenses. Shehaya kaful means it's in the past tense. It was double as thick. Umechupal implies a future tense. Umechupal, it will be a double as thick. Therefore, we realize that the Midrash is referring to two distinct time periods. The past, which refers to the Egyptian exile, and the future, which refers to another form of exile. Let's determine what and how. We said earlier that HaKadosh Baruch Hu used Makat Choshech in order to wipe out the Rishaim among Klal Yisrael. But how many Jews perished in that plague of darkness? Let's see. In Parashat Beshalach, the pasuk says, Vayasev Elokim et ha'am derech hamidbar Yam Suf, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned the people towards the way of the wilderness to the sea, to Yam Suf. V'chamushim alu vnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. And the Jewish people were armed when they left Egypt. So, on the simple level, the word chamushim means they were armed. They had weapons with them. But Chachamim revealed to us that the word chamushim alu implies that actually there was only 1/5 of the Jewish people that left. Chamushim, from the lashon of chamesh. Chamesh is the number 5. Only 1/5, chamushim alu, only 1/5 of the Jewish people left Mitzrayim. Ladies, that's frightening. And Rashi HaKadosh strengthens this idea by stating the following. He says, Echad michamisha yatzu. He strengthens that. He says, 1 out of every 5 Jews left. Ve'arba'a chalakim metu b'shloshat yemei ha'afela. You hear this? He says, and 4/5 died during the 3 days of darkness. 4/5, my dear friends, is a large number of people. That's the majority of our nation. Let's see exactly how many perished and why that number is so significant to us. At the end of Parashat Bo, we're given a basic number by which we use to calculate the number of people that left. It says, K600,000 raglei hagvarim. 600,000 is the basic number that the Torah uses to describe those who were counted and left. That's the basic number. If only 1/5 left, And we're saying 600,000 is that basic number of the people who left. How many perished? Well, you times 1/5 times 600,000. 3 million people died during Makat Choshech. If 1/5 is 600,000, times that by 5, that's 3 million people. 3 million people died in the plague of darkness. You know what a staggering number this is? But why is this number so significant to us today, for this shiur? What is the Torah HaKadosha trying to hint to us in hidden codes? Let's take a look at the word vayamesh, which means that the thick darkness, the tangible darkness that Rashi and the Midrash were talking about, let's take a look at that word. The word vayamesh is spelled Vav, Yud, Mem, Shin. What's one letter before Vav? It's a Hey. And one letter before Yud is Tet. One letter before Mem is Lamed. And one letter before Shin is Resh. Ladies, what does this spell? It spells the name Hitler. Yemach Shemo v'zichro. And how many Jews perished during that dark and tangible period in the history of our people? 6 million Jews. Umechupal. That's double. That doubled. That's double the 3 million that died in Egypt. The Midrash is telling us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu hinted to us that 3 million people died in Makat Choshech in Egypt because they weren't chozring b'tshuva. They assimilated and they chose to ignore the warnings even when they saw the miracles and the wondrous sights before their very eyes, even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was right there with them in the center of everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was warning us that if we don't use Egypt as a historical lesson, then unfortunately the darkness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought upon Mitzrayim will be double as thick. And so it was. Lo alenu. Because tragically, 6 million of our brothers and sisters perished in this other plague of darkness during the Nazi era. And all the photos and all the films that they show of that time depict a darkened sky over Europe. The skies over Germany were so dark, so gray from the ashes of the burning bodies that descended upward into the Shamayim. My dear sisters out there, in the merit of righteous women, our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. And it's going to be in our merit that we're going to be redeemed once again. You have to remember that each letter, each word, each pasuk in our Torah is a lesson for our generation. The Torah is not a history book. It's a reality beyond the reality we know. It is a holy work that was given to us by our Creator, who wished for us to grow from the lessons that He imparted to us in His holy manuscript. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to know that if you want to know what the future holds, Ezehu Chacham Haro'eh Hanolad. Who is wise? He who can see and determine what the future is going to be like. Throughout the generations, throughout the history of our people, we were warned time and again of what would occur if we don't accept the truth and change the course that our lives have taken. So often HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us chances, gave us the gift of prophets, of Chachamim, Tzaddikim, Rabbanim, who tried to lead us in an attempt to straighten us out. We have an obligation to review our past and to recognize the powers of the Ribono Shel Olam. We should realize that not once in our history was there ever a time where we found the Torah to be false or misleading. Our Torah is Torat Emet. It is the truth. It is Emet. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made promises in that Torah and He kept them. We're the ones who didn't keep our part of the deal. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu beseeches us. He cries for us. He says, Shuvu banim, come back to me, my children. Ladies, help me bring the Jewish women back to their faith. Help me strengthen and fortify their spirituality. We are going to expand our horizons here. We're going to knock down some walls and make the space bigger so that more and more women, more and more young people can attend our functions and grow in areas of Torah, grow in areas of Ruchaniyut, strengthen themselves against this monster of the Yetzer Hara of this generation. But I cannot do it alone. I need help. So please, you all asked me, some of you asked me, can you show us a little bit about what Ohel Sarah is about? Like, what is this organization? What's the point of the organization? The basic point is to teach Torah to women and young girls in a warm environment, which is why we choose to have our setting in an apartment and not in some shul or somewhere. The ladies like congregating here. The young girls like to come. The main gist is to give it over in a warm and happy way, in a way that the ladies will want to grow and accept Torah and love it, because they're so happy, because we embrace them, because we love them, because we treat them with such kavod. We want happiness to reign. We want them to be besimcha. We want them to serve Hashem with happiness. I'm going to show you a 3-minute clip of what we do here at Ohel Sarah and the happiness that's projected. You're going to feel that. And then after that, I'll come back and finish the rest of the shiur.
Zechor ahavas kedimim v'yachyeini ledumim v'vekarev hayumim v'vekarev hayumim asher b'nisham v'vaychoi. Oh, is khayr habas kedimim. Oh, ibyachyein ledumim. Oh, ibkavarei vayumim. Oh, ibkarei Hashem b'nisham v'vaychoi. Asher ben yishaychoy zchoir havas kevetimim ve'achenir dumim ve'korev hayumim asher ben yishaychoy zchoir havas kevetimim ve'achenir dumim ve'korev hayumim asher ben yishaychoy zchoir havas kevetimim ve'achenir dumim ve'korev hayumim asher ben yishaychoy zchoir havas kevetimim ve'achenir dumim oy ve'korev hayumim asher ben yishaychoy zchoir havas kevetimim ve'achenir dumim oy ve'korev hayumim asher ben yishaychoy libi li
Ladies, as you can see from our clip, the ladies are happy. The ladies are besimcha. Look how many have a genuine smile on their face. We take pride in the fact that we could promote Yahadut with simcha and make the ladies want to keep the mitzvot. But I need your help, because there's so many people out there, unfortunately, who have been swallowed up by the modern society, by the secular world. Not only that, but if you noticed, towards the end of the clip, there was a picture there of me together with the daughters of the Baba Sali. A few years ago, I met them at an event, at a Rosh Chodesh event. It was Rosh Chodesh Adar at a friend of mine's house in Yerushalayim. And I couldn't believe that I had the zechut to sit next to these two incredibly righteous women who were the daughters of the Baba Sali. And we were talking. And I was telling them that I'm going back to America and I'm going to expand the organization and bring more people into it. And you don't know how they were giving blessings. And they were saying, you don't know how our father holds from these things and how we held from these things. They gave me a bracha. Ladies, I felt so privileged, you have no clue. And of course, we have the bracha of Rav Ovadia Yosef alav shalom, who always encouraged us to continue to expand and to promote and to bring more and more, as many ladies as possible. Help me help these women. Help me help these women. You can log on to www.ohelsara.com and click on donate, and please specify that you are helping us with the renovations. It would be great if I could get 100 ladies, just 100 ladies to give $35, or the reverse, 35 ladies to give $100. That would pretty much help us with everything that we need. Be'ezrat Hashem, as soon as we start the renovations, I'm going to film it and show you what's going on, and I'm also going to show you the finished product and the Chanukat Habayit that we plan to have once we finish the project. But it's so important that you help me, because I do find that in this generation, so many women so many Jews are losing their way. And I always ask myself, why do we seek the false pleasures of a society that hasn't once experienced the miracles or the promises that we've been privileged to witness? The Goyim don't have what we have. If we were chosen to be a holy nation, an Am Segula, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's the one who gave us the stamp of approval. Why do we seek approval from other countries, other societies, and other communities? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us, saying, Kedoshim te'iyu la'Hashem, why do we go against the nature of our nation, against the qualities that were deemed so unique, so special in the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam? Do you know how special you are? You know how holy you are? Who gave you that stamp of Kedusha? The Ribono Shel Olam. Can you get any better than that? Ladies, it's up to us as women who have the potential to be tzadkaniyot, to direct our household towards the path of truth and Kedusha. And so many of you, Baruch Hashem, are doing that. Ashrechem. I'm so proud of you. So many of you write into me how you took one thing or another upon yourselves for the sake of the Am. Ashrechem Yisrael, Mike'amcha Yisrael. And it's our duty to continue to remain unique and distinctly different. It is a privilege to be deemed holy, and we have to be proud of it. We have to be proud of it. So let's hope that in the merit of our mitzvot, of our chasadim, of all the donations that are going to be coming in to help Klal Yisrael, of our attempts to reach levels of kedusha, of remaining kedoshim and remaining separate, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will see the good that we've wrought in the world, and that He'll bring the Mashiach without any further suffering, but rather the opposite. He's going to bring Mashiach with nisim, with wondrous miracles, with a joy just like it was when we left Egypt all those years ago. The way we were rejoicing and dancing. Imagine having the privilege and the honor of being one of the many women who will help to create merits that are going to redeem our people. Imagine being one of those ladies. Ladies, stay strong. Be proud of being uniquely and distinctly holy. And together, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to experience, you and me, the final Geula in our days. Amen Ken, Yehi Ratzon. Have a warm, pleasant, and inspirational Shabbat.